No nanny ever lasted more than 3 days. The twins were legends, 6-year-old terrors raised in a billionaire's penthouse, armed with tantrums, traps, and an uncanny ability to send professionals fleeing before the week was out. Every agency in the city had given up, until Sophia Reid walked through the door. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She simply said, "I've handled worse." What she saw behind the chaos wasn't madness, it was pain. And what she did next would not only tame the untouchable twins, but heal a broken home no one dared enter. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The elevator doors glided open with a soft chime, revealing the top floor of the towering steel and glass monolith that was Blake Industries' headquarters. But this wasn't an office floor. This was the penthouse residence of Donald Blake, the enigmatic tech billionaire whose name commanded respect, curiosity, and more than a little fear. The penthouse, while sleek and expansive, held a quiet unease beneath its pristine surfaces. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the skyline, filtering the afternoon sun into sharp angles of gold, but the light couldn't soften the tension that seemed to hover in the air like static. It wasn't Donald Blake's presence that made the place feel heavy. In truth, he was rarely there. What haunted the penthouse was something far smaller, yet far more destructive. The twins, Mason and Max Blake, 6 years old, identical, unrelenting. "I swear, I'll never come back here again," muttered the woman in the hallway, dragging a broken heel and a stained white blouse behind her as she stormed toward the elevator. Her purse hung open, its contents spilling with each furious step. "You were only here 2 days," the housekeeper called after her helplessly. The woman didn't even turn around. "They locked me in a linen closet, with a dead mouse, and laughed about it for an hour." The doors slammed shut behind her. Inside the apartment, a shattered picture frame lay by the entryway. An expensive-looking tablet was cracked in half on the kitchen island. Somewhere in the west wing of the penthouse, the faint sound of a toy piano being smashed against the floor echoed like a war drum. Mrs. Adelaide, the senior housekeeper who had been with the family for over a decade, shook her head and muttered under her breath, "That's the 3rd one this month." "4th," corrected Michael, the chef, as he walked past holding a tray of untouched chicken tenders shaped like dinosaurs. "Don't forget the one who left without even collecting her first paycheck." Adelaide sighed and adjusted her apron. "What's the count now?" 17 nannies, Michael replied without missing a beat. "In less than a year." And so the legacy of the Blake twins continued. A trail of exhausted caregivers, destroyed property, and mounting frustration. The boys were a paradox. Perfectly dressed, eerily quiet when they wanted to be, eerily loud when they didn't. They could smile with cherubic innocence one moment and draw on antique wallpaper with permanent markers the next. They communicated with each other in coded whispers, forming schemes that bewildered even seasoned professionals. No one could quite pin down their method of operation, but everyone agreed on one thing. The twins didn't want a nanny. They wanted a challenge. And they always won. Donald Blake knew it. He had been warned enough times by every reputable agency in the city. After the 3rd or 4th resignation, some had laughed nervously and called his sons a little high energy. By the 10th, they spoke in hushed tones and politely declined further involvement. By the 15th, no agency in Manhattan would take his calls. Except one. And they had only agreed out of desperation, hoping to fill a position no one else wanted. Even they had added a disclaimer in the contract. No guarantees. No refunds. No lawsuits. Mr. Blake, to his credit, didn't get angry anymore. His anger had calcified into indifference. In the middle of a conference call one morning, he turned to his assistant and said flatly, "Find another nanny. The boys will need someone by the afternoon." "But sir," she began cautiously, there's no one left. "I've called every." "I said find someone," he interrupted, eyes still fixed on the glowing screen of data projections. Just make sure she lasts at least until Monday. It was Thursday. As the day wore on, the apartment buzzed with the sounds of unpredictable chaos. Max was currently constructing a trap involving tripwire and marbles. Mason had dismantled the television remote and was now experimenting with inserting jelly beans into the battery slot. Michael, the chef, turned to the butler in a low whisper. "One of these days," he said, "someone is going to walk through that door and tame those demons." The butler raised an eyebrow. "And I hope I live long enough to see it." Just then the front door buzzed. Another nanny. Poor soul. They watched as the elevator descended to the lobby. Sophia Reid sat in the cracked faux leather chair of a job agency office, staring at the clipboard in her lap. "Do you have any previous experience working with children?" the recruiter asked, not even looking up from her computer as her manicured fingers flew across the keyboard. "Yes," Sophia replied calmly. "Foster care system. 5 years. Group home placements. And I worked privately with children who had behavioral disorders and PTSD." That got the recruiter's attention. She paused mid-keystroke and looked up, squinting slightly, as if trying to decide if Sophia was being honest or delusional. "You handled kids with trauma?" the recruiter asked, leaning in. "Handled? No," Sophia said. "I listened to them, fought for them, helped them find some kind of ground to stand on again." The recruiter tilted her head and raised an eyebrow. Then she pushed a file slowly across the desk toward Sophia like it might burn her fingers. "Ever hear of the Blake twins?" Sophia opened the file. 2 black and white passport photos of near-identical boys stared up at her with blank expressions. Underneath their names, Mason and Max Blake, was a list of nanny resignations, dates, and disciplinary notes that read more like military reports than childcare logs. "This isn't a childcare job," the recruiter said plainly. "It's a test of survival." Sophia didn't flinch. She was too tired to flinch. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Her mother's hospital bills were overdue. Her landlord had already taped a notice to her door. Her fridge at home held a bottle of mustard and half a lemon. This job paid $10,000 a week. "I'll take it," she said, steady. "You didn't even read the full report. I've handled worse." The recruiter sat back in her chair and muttered under her breath. "Everyone says that. Until they don't." Sophia arrived at the Blake penthouse the next morning at precisely 7:45 a.m., dressed in plain navy slacks, a soft cotton blouse, and a satchel worn from years of use but organized with methodical care. Her long, dark curls were pinned up in a loose bun. She wore no makeup. She didn't need it. Mrs. Adelaide, the housekeeper, met her at the door, arms crossed. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, eyeing Sophia with a mix of skepticism and pity. Sophia nodded. Adelaide sighed and gestured her in. "Well, God help you." The door closed behind her with a heavy click. Within minutes, the assault began. From the hallway, a sharp voice called out, "She's here." Another one. A bucket of glitter paint, purple and sticky, came flying out of nowhere and exploded across the floor in front of Sophia's shoes. Then came the sound of running feet and maniacal giggles. Sophia paused. She didn't yell. She didn't jump. Instead, she knelt and examined the paint's trajectory. "Angle of attack, 6 feet away, upper-level balcony," she murmured to herself. "You're weird," came a tiny voice from above. She looked up and saw 2 identical faces peering over the staircase railing. One with a slingshot in hand, the other with a smirk that was far too adult for a 6-year-old. "Hi," Sophia said, standing slowly. "I'm Sophia. You must be Mason and Max." The twins stared. "No screaming? No calling for Daddy?" Max asked. "Nope," Sophia replied. Mason narrowed his eyes. "You're not scared?" "Should I be?" They disappeared back behind the railing. The next few hours were a marathon of tests. They locked her out on the balcony. She climbed back in through the kitchen window. They unscrewed the legs on a chair. She sat on the floor instead. They replaced the sugar with salt in her tea. She drank it, grimaced once, and said, "New flavor." Every response confused them. Every dodge intrigued them. Sophia never yelled, never lectured, never threatened to quit. Instead, she watched. She noticed how Mason clenched his hands when Max got too loud. How Max grew agitated whenever Mason withdrew. She noticed that their insults mirrored phrases adults might have said in arguments. Sharp, rehearsed, unnatural for their age. By noon, the twins were huddled in a corner whispering furiously. "She's not like the others," Max said. "She didn't cry when we locked her out," Mason added. "She climbed in the window. Do you think she's fun? She might be dangerous." Sophia passed by them, not saying a word, just smiling softly as she carried their untouched breakfast back to the kitchen. Michael, the chef, watched her with astonishment. "You survived," he whispered. "I'm just getting started," she said, rinsing off the glitter-covered tray. Upstairs, in his office with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, Donald Blake glanced down at the security feed on his monitor. He watched the quiet Nanny lift a spilled puzzle off the floor, carefully reassemble it on the table, then walk away without a word. For the first time in months, he didn't delete the footage. He leaned back in his chair and muttered, "Let's see how long this one lasts." The sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the east-facing windows, casting pale amber streaks across the tiled floor of the boys' playroom. It had once been a warm, colorful space, painted a soft sky blue, shelves lined with hand-picked toys, plush rugs underfoot. But over time, it had grown cold. Stiff. Unloved. As if it had inherited the moods of its little kings. Sophia stood silently in the doorway, sipping a cup of lukewarm tea as the twins thundered through the room like wild horses, shrieking and tossing toy dinosaurs against the wall. The first 2 days had been a hurricane. Not of chaos, but of silence, then sudden eruption. Of side eyes, of traps set with toy cars across thresholds, of bizarre challenges. One day, they demanded pancakes shaped like superheroes. The next, they threw those same pancakes at the wall because the syrup wasn't the right kind. Sophia never rose to the bait. She watched. Not just what they did, but what they didn't. They rarely looked each other in the eye. They never hugged. They flinched subtly when an adult raised their voice, even if it wasn't directed at them. That morning, as Max was lining up dinosaur figurines in some unintelligible but meticulous order, Mason began drumming on the table with a wooden spoon. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but it was sharp, repetitive. With every strike, Max's breathing changed. At first, it was barely noticeable, but then his fingers started to twitch. His jaw clenched. He knocked over one of the figurines. Mason kept drumming. "Stop it!" Max finally screamed, grabbing the spoon and hurling it across the room. Sophia didn't interfere. She crouched down slowly and said, "Too loud." Max blinked at her, startled. "It's okay," she continued gently. "You like quiet when you're concentrating." He nodded once, barely, but it was there. That night, after the boys were finally in bed, Sophia sat at the long marble kitchen counter, her laptop open, fingers moving with purpose. Auditory sensitivity. Trauma triggers in children. Repetitive sounds. She read articles. Watched TED Talks. Pulled up child psychology journals she hadn't touched since her group home training. She scribbled notes. Max had a sound sensitivity. Mason didn't. But Mason only drummed when Max was distracted. Why? She checked her notes from earlier in the day. Time of outburst, 10:42 a.m. Father's morning meeting ended at 10:30 a.m. Security footage timestamp. Elevator arrived 10:35 a.m. So Donald Blake had returned briefly, unannounced, and the tension began the moment the twins sensed his arrival. Neither ran to greet him. Neither acknowledged him. He hadn't entered the playroom. But they'd known. She remembered the way Mason stiffened when footsteps echoed from the hallway. The glance Max gave the closed door. These weren't tantrums. They were messages. In a language no one had bothered to learn. The next day, Sophia arrived at the playroom early. Before the twins. She replaced the wooden spoon with a rubber-tipped stick. Left a new set of soft, noise-dampening headphones on Max's side of the table. Then, she sat cross-legged on the floor and waited. When they walked in, They froze at the sight of her. "You're early," Mason said suspiciously. "I wanted to try something new," she replied. "New is boring," Max snapped. "Then you'll probably hate this." That got their attention. Over the next hour, she gently guided them through a structured game she called Silent Sounds. They had to sit still and listen for 3 sounds in the room: a clock ticking, a car horn below, the wind brushing against the glass. They were wary at first. But eventually, Max leaned his head to the side and whispered, "I hear my brother breathing." Mason punched him in the arm, but lightly. They both laughed. That night, Max asked if he could sleep with the headphones. Just in case. Sophia tucked him in and said, "Of course." Later, she found herself in the hallway outside Mr. Blake's home office. The door was cracked. She knocked softly and stepped in. He looked up from a tablet. Exhausted. Stubbled. Confused to see her. "Yes," he asked, voice like ice. "I'd like to adjust the twins' daily routine," she said, standing her ground. "Less screen time. More sensory play. And silence breaks." Mr. Blake raised an eyebrow. "Sensory what?" "They're overwhelmed, Mr. Blake. It comes out as misbehavior. But it's communication. You just haven't been listening." He stared at her. "Have you considered they act out every time you come home?" she added carefully. His face shifted, just barely. "No one has ever said that to me," he muttered. "No one stayed long enough to." She left without waiting for a reply. The next morning, the twins were waiting for her in the playroom before she arrived. Mason was already wearing the headphones. Max held up a drawing, scribbled, chaotic, but unmistakable. It was Sophia, smiling, arms open, and the twins standing on either side. "She's weird," Max said. "But we like her," Mason finished. They didn't say it out loud, but they had chosen her. And Sophia, with her notebook full of clues and heart full of patience, finally had the key. Sophia stood at the edge of the rooftop garden as the city stirred to life below. The skyline of Manhattan sparkled in the morning haze, cold steel kissing the clouds. But her eyes weren't on the horizon. They were fixed on the 2 small figures crouched in the corner near the herb boxes. Max and Mason were whispering again. Their heads leaned toward one another, backs arched like twin foxes in a silent hunt. It was their code, their fortress, the way they controlled their world. Sophia didn't interrupt. Instead, she sat down on a bench and pulled a book from her bag, The Secret Garden, and began to read aloud. Not to them, just into the air. And Mary, who had never known a place that belonged just to her, began to believe in something wild and impossible. The whispering stopped. Max peeked over his shoulder. Mason slowly turned. She read on. 5 minutes later, they were both beside her on the bench, without a word, pressing into her sides like ivy growing toward sunlight. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't progress. It was curiosity. Later that afternoon, in the playroom, Sophia laid out 3 boxes on the rug. Each was unlabeled. Each contained different objects. "Choose one," she said simply. Max picked the first box. Inside were various fidget toys, spinners, squish balls, and small sandbags. Mason picked the second. Books, puzzle pieces, and a music box. Sophia opened the third herself. Art supplies. Blank paper. Paints. "This is called a sensory map," she explained gently. "Some things make us calm. Others make us mad. Some help us focus." "You mean like the bubble wrap?" Max asked, already pressing a sheet between his fingers. "Exactly." She watched as Mason opened the music box. A soft, tinkling melody played, twinkling and broken but beautiful. He didn't smile, but he didn't flinch either. Sophia took note of everything. Every shift in breath. Every time they gravitated toward a color or sound or scent. These weren't tantrums, they were signals. By the end of the week, she implemented changes so subtle the boys didn't even realize what had happened. She placed scent diffusers in their rooms. Lavender for Max, peppermint for Mason. She switched the harsh overhead lighting to adjustable lamps with warm hues. Instead of barking orders, "Time for bed," or "Clean up," she used a visual chart where they could track their day. stickers for each completed task. They didn't rebel. They simply followed, because they felt in control. Safe. But the true breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday. The storm had rolled in quickly, skies turning from pale silver to bruised gray in an hour. Thunder cracked like bones in the sky. Max was pacing. Mason had hidden under the table. Sophia dimmed the lights and closed the blinds. Then she grabbed a blanket, 2 headlamps, and a stack of pillows. "I'm building a storm shelter," she said aloud. "Just in case." Max stopped pacing. Sophia crawled under the dining table with the flashlight and made a small cocoon of softness and safety. She didn't call to them, didn't coax. She just waited. After 2 minutes, Max slid in beside her. Then Mason. All 3 of them sat in silence as the storm thudded around them. "I hate thunder," Max whispered, his voice small. "It makes my chest feel tight," Mason added. Sophia didn't say, "Don't be scared." She didn't say, "You're okay." She said, "Me too." And the tension broke. Max leaned his head on her shoulder. Mason handed her one of his toy dinosaurs, a battered, one-eyed triceratops. It was a peace offering. The next morning, Mr. Blake was pouring himself a coffee in the kitchen when he heard something unusual. Laughter. Not mischievous. Not manic. Joyful. He turned the corner and saw them. Sophia and the twins on the living room floor, tangled in a sea of construction paper, glue sticks, and glitter. Max had made a lopsided crown. Mason had drawn a crooked castle with windows that looked suspiciously like their penthouse. And Sophia, glitter on her cheek, socks mismatched, was wearing a cape made of aluminum foil and newspaper. "She's the queen of not quitting," Max announced proudly. Mr. Blake stared. The sound, the energy, the lightness, it was foreign to his home, to his sons. And yet, it felt like something he'd once known, something his wife had brought with her. "Boys," he called. "Can I speak with Sophia, please?" They groaned but obeyed. Max handed her the glitter crown before scampering off. Sophia stood in the archway, suddenly aware of the glitter in her hair and the paint on her sleeve. Donald Blake didn't look angry, but he didn't look pleased either. "I've reviewed your weekly progress notes," he said, motioning to a tablet on the counter. She waited. "You've changed their schedules. Their rooms. Their diet." "Yes. You didn't consult me. You weren't here." Silence stretched between them like glass. He placed the tablet down. "They haven't locked anyone in a closet this week." "No," she agreed. "They haven't had to." He crossed his arms. "So what's your secret?" Sophia looked him in the eye. Calm. Steady. "No secret. I just stopped trying to fix them and started trying to understand them." He didn't answer right away, just stared at her with something unreadable in his gaze. Finally, he said, "You've lasted longer than anyone." "I'm not here to survive them, Mr. Blake," she replied. "I'm here to see them." And for the first time, he didn't argue. Donald Blake hadn't taken a full day off in nearly 7 years. Even after the accident, even after the funeral, especially after the funeral, he had returned to his office, locking himself in meetings, spreadsheets, acquisitions, boardrooms, and code. The outside world was chaos, but numbers made sense. They obeyed. They didn't cry at night or ask questions he couldn't answer. They didn't remind him of her. Until now. Now, his own home no longer followed the sterile pattern he had designed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it first truly struck him. He had returned early from the office, earlier than expected, because his assistant had pushed a reminder, parent-teacher video conference. His son's school had scheduled it weeks ago. He hadn't planned to join. He never did. But something made him walk down the hall. From the doorway of the media room, he saw Sophia sitting on the floor, laptop balanced on her knees. Max was curled up beside her, head resting against her hip. Mason lay on his stomach nearby, absently scribbling a drawing. The teacher on screen said, "We're seeing better emotional regulation from both boys." Max raised his hand today. Mason volunteered to lead story time. Donald blinked. "Volunteered?" He stepped forward. His dress shoes tapped against the hardwood floor. Max looked up, startled. His eyes searched Sophia's face first before turning to his father. "Dad," he said flatly. Then he turned back to the laptop. Sophia, without breaking her posture, tilted her head slightly toward Donald. "You're welcome to join," she said softly. "We're just wrapping up." He sat stiffly in the armchair across from them. He didn't say much, just listened. That evening, he found himself pacing outside the boys' room. Through the crack in the door, he could hear their voices. "And then she told us if we listened really hard, we could hear the stars hum," Mason was saying. "Not real humming," Max added quickly, "but like in our heads." Sophia laughed. "I said maybe the stars remember everything we forget." Donald backed away, his chest tight. His late wife, Susan, used to say something almost exactly like that. "The stars are memory keepers," she whispered to the boys when they were babies. "They hold everything we can't." He hadn't heard those words spoken in years. He stood there a moment longer, then walked away. The next morning, he stayed home for breakfast. No laptop. No phone. The chef, Michael, was too stunned to speak. Mrs. Adelaide actually dropped a spoon. He sat at the table awkwardly, unsure if he should speak or wait. Sophia entered with the twins, Max in a hoodie 3 sizes too big, Mason with his socks mismatched, and they stopped in their tracks. "You're here?" Max asked, narrowing his eyes. "I am," Donald replied. "Did your office burn down?" Mason asked hopefully. "No." Max slid into his seat with suspicion. "Then why are you here?" Sophia glanced at Donald and said nothing. He cleared his throat. "I thought I'd join you, just to see how breakfast goes." They stared at him as if he'd announced he was moving to Mars. "Do you know how to pour cereal?" Max asked, almost concerned. "I think I can manage." He reached for the milk carton, fumbled it, and nearly spilled the entire thing. Mason laughed, really laughed, and Max let out a small snort he tried to cover. Sophia smiled to herself. Later that week, Donald called Sophia into his study. It was the first time he had summoned her like this, not as an employer demanding answers, but as a man with questions. She entered cautiously, unsure which version of him she'd meet. He stood behind his desk, looking out the window at the city. "They talk about her," he said quietly. "Who?" she asked. "Susan. Their mother." Sophia nodded. "They mention her in passing. Like she's a fairy tale they're still trying to believe in. They don't know how to talk about grief," she said gently. "They were too young to understand what it meant when she didn't come back." He turned, eyes sharp. "They used to cry at night. Then they stopped. I thought that meant they were okay." "No, Mr. Blake," she said. "It meant they stopped hoping you'd come." He sat down heavily. Sophia moved to the edge of the desk and lowered her voice. "They needed you. Still do." "I didn't know how to be a father without her," he admitted. "No one does," she replied. "We figure it out. Or we lose them." There was a long silence between them. Then Donald said, "Will you help me try?" Sophia's answer was a soft nod. "I already am." The transformation wasn't instant. Donald was still awkward, still distant, but he started showing up. He watched their therapy-inspired games from the hallway. He sat in on talk time and stumbled through emotion cards. One evening, when Max began to tremble during a story, Donald didn't hand him off to Sophia. He wrapped his arms around his son and held on. Sophia watched unseen from the kitchen. She didn't interrupt. Just let the scene unfold like a garden finally blooming after a long, brutal frost. That night, as she was turning off the lights, Mason tugged at her sleeve. He looked up at her, his face a question. "Do you think he's staying this time?" he whispered. Sophia knelt. "Yes," she said. "I think he finally hears you now." Mason didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed. As Sophia tucked them in, Max rolled over and said, "You're not just our nanny anymore, you know." Sophia paused. "Then what am I?" He shrugged, pulling the blanket to his chin. "You're the one who made him come back." The morning sun filtered gently through the linen curtains, casting soft golden shapes across the boys' room. For once, the silence was peaceful, not strained, not brooding. It was the kind of silence born of calm hearts, not clenched ones. Sophia sat cross-legged on the rug, brushing tiny flecks of glitter off her jeans. The crown Max had made for her, constructed of cardboard, glue, and determination, was beginning to wilt under the weight of its own rhinestones. But she wore it anyway. "Does that make you queen now?" Mason asked from the bed, his arms wrapped around his triceratops plush. "No," Sophia said with mock seriousness. "It makes me head of royal cleanup duty. You two left a trail of sequins in every hallway." Max giggled from the floor. "A glitter trap for intruders." "Effective," Sophia said, standing. "I nearly lost a sock." Donald stood outside the door, watching unseen. He had intended to knock, to call the boys to breakfast, but the warmth in the room anchored him to the spot. He hadn't seen this version of his sons before. Max, laughing softly. Mason, sprawled on the bed like a child who trusted the space he slept in. It made his throat tighten. He turned and walked to the kitchen, where Michael was quietly preparing breakfast. "Make it 2 extra plates," Donald said. "For guests?" "No," he replied, then added, "for us." By mid-morning, the twins were sitting at the kitchen island, chewing quietly. Max was flicking a spoon back and forth over his cereal bowl. Mason had his headphones resting around his neck like a badge of comfort. Sophia stood at the counter, helping Adelaide stack clean dishes when Donald cleared his throat. "I was thinking," he said, drawing every eye to him at once, especially the boys, who stared with curiosity and a little suspicion. "Maybe this weekend we could go out. Together. The park or somewhere." "Why?" Mason asked immediately. Donald blinked. "Because I want to spend time with you." Max narrowed his eyes. "You don't even like parks." Sophia, trying not to smile, said gently, "He's trying." The twins exchanged a look, a full-blown sibling conversation in 2 seconds of silence. Then Max shrugged. "Only if we get ice cream," Mason added, "and I get to bring my dinosaurs." "Deal," Donald said before he could think better of it. Sophia watched the moment quietly. The once frozen wall between father and sons had begun to thaw, one uncertain gesture at a time. The weekend came, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, the Blake family, as a unit, stepped out into the world. Donald wore a navy sweater instead of a suit. The boys each wore mismatched socks, and Sophia wore her glitter crown again, at Max's insistence. They walked through Central Park like a strange, unpolished mosaic. Donald carried Mason on his shoulders for a full 10 minutes, groaning under his weight but never asking to put him down. Max led the pack, shouting dinosaur facts to uninterested pigeons. At the ice cream stand, Mason handed Sophia a dripping cone and said, "You're not just the nanny." "Oh," she asked, licking a streak off her wrist. "You're kind of like the boss of the house." "She's the mom now," Max added matter-of-factly, then took a big bite of mint chocolate chip. Donald choked on his water. Sophia froze. "No one can replace your mom," she said gently, kneeling beside them. "We know," Mason replied, shrugging. "But you make the house feel not so broken." Sophia's eyes stung. Donald didn't say anything for a while. But that night, long after the twins had fallen asleep in a pile of storybooks and blankets, he found Sophia in the study. She was organizing art supplies into bins, glue sticks, watercolors, safety scissors. "I never thought I'd see them like this again," he said quietly. "They were always this way," she replied. "They just needed permission." "To be children?" he asked. "To be safe." Donald crossed his arms, hesitated, then said, "They love you." "I love them too." "You could leave," he said. "Take another job. A bigger offer. Something easier." "I could," she said simply, "but I won't." He nodded. Then, to her surprise, he sat beside her on the floor. Together, they sorted pipe cleaners in silence. Weeks turned into months. Sophia became more than a caregiver. She was the rhythm of the household. The quiet behind every laugh, the calm after every meltdown. The twins would reach for her hand without thinking. Donald began consulting her on decisions beyond the children. Interior changes, vacation plans, even meals. The staff stopped calling her Miss Sophia. They called her ours. On a warm Sunday morning, Donald stood at the edge of the backyard terrace, watching the twins play tag among the flower beds. Sophia walked up beside him, a coffee in hand. "I was thinking about the foundation," he said. She tilted her head. "I started one after Susan died. Never did much with it. Just a name and a donation account. I want to make it real. For children. For grief support. Therapy. Advocacy." Sophia's eyes widened. "I want you to run it," he said. She stared. "I know you're not licensed in psychology anymore," he added. "But you're the reason they're healing. You're the reason I am. You turned a haunted house into a home." Sophia didn't speak right away. Then she reached for his hand. "Only if I can still tuck them in." He smiled, really smiled, not the corporate kind. "You'd better." That night, after story time, Mason looked up sleepily from his pillow and said, "Do you think she'll always stay?" Max murmured, "She's not going anywhere. Dad needs her too." And in the quiet dark, the stars blinked above Manhattan. Unseen but listening. A year later, spring arrived quietly, without ceremony, but full of signs. The cherry blossoms bloomed early that year. Not just in Central Park, but in the small rooftop garden above the Blake penthouse. The one that had once been overrun with dust and neglect was now alive again. Sunflowers, herbs, a stubborn tomato plant that Max insisted was his science experiment. Sophia stood at the garden rail, the breeze teasing loose strands from her braid. Her clipboard, once filled with behavioral tracking notes and emergency schedules, now held lesson plans for weekend enrichment, nature scavenger hunts, and a grant proposal waiting for review. From below, a squeal pierced the air. "Dad." Max cheated. "I did not. Mason's just slow." Footsteps thundered up the stairs. Sophia barely turned before both twins crashed into her from behind, each clinging to a leg like rival pirates claiming a treasure. Donald followed, slightly out of breath, holding a foam sword in one hand and a half-eaten granola bar in the other. He wore jeans and a t-shirt, the kind with soft edges worn by time, not iron starch. "I don't think pirates argue about who's faster," Sophia said, crouching to separate them. "We're competitive pirates," Max explained, cheeks flushed from running. Mason added, "And Dad's the sea monster." Donald raised his hands in mock surrender. "Guilty. But I demand a rematch." Sophia shook her head, laughing. "You all need lunch. Come on. We've got leftovers and fresh bread." As the boys ran down the stairs, Sophia and Donald lingered behind. He leaned against the railing beside her, quiet for a moment. "This place doesn't feel like it used to." "No," she said. "It feels like it belongs to someone now." He looked at her, not just at her, but into her, with the kind of gaze that had grown more frequent in recent months. Not filled with confusion or disbelief or guarded distance, but with something like reverence. "I didn't think I'd get to have this," he said softly. "What?" "A second chance." Sophia didn't answer with words. She just slipped her fingers through his. Not as a promise. Not as a performance. Just truth. By summer, the Susan Blake Foundation for Child Resilience launched publicly. The announcement made headlines, not because of its billionaire backer, but because of its mission. Hands-on programs for grieving children, trauma-informed education for caregivers, and direct family support for survivors of loss. Sophia's name was listed as executive director, but the boys still called her Soph or Boss Lady, depending on their moods. She still did bedtime, still baked muffins when they were sick, still sat on the floor when emotions ran high, arms open, steady. On the morning of the first anniversary of Susan's passing, Donald sat on the couch with a photo album in his lap. Not the digital kind, the old one. The one with fingerprints, cracked corners, and sticky plastic pages. Sophia came in, carrying 2 cups of tea. He looked up at her. "Will you help me tell them about her? Really tell them?" "Yes," she said. "She's part of their story." And so they did. That evening, with rain tapping against the windows, the 4 of them sat on the rug. The boys asked hard questions. Donald cried, unashamed honest. Sophia listened, filled in the silences, bridged the moments where grief threatened to swallow the words. And when Mason asked, "Do you think she'd like you?" Sophia held his hand and said, I think she'd love how much of her lives in you. In autumn, the twins started a new school. Max wore a dinosaur backpack. Mason carried a sketch pad full of cartoon storm clouds and stars. Donald walked them to the gate. Sophia held their hands on either side, a comforting anchor. Do you have to leave? Max asked as they reached the steps. I'm not going anywhere, she promised. Mason nodded, satisfied. Good. And just like that, they ran off, into a crowd of backpacks and laughter and the unknown. Later that night, Sophia stood by the large picture window, arms folded. Donald walked in behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. They'll be okay. I know, she said. But it's still hard to let go, even just a little. He rested his chin on her shoulder. They'll always come back to you. Sophia didn't speak, but her smile said it all. On a cold winter night, with the city glowing under 1,000 golden lights, the twins, now taller, a little wiser, snuck into the living room with paper, glue, and scissors. They worked quietly for an hour. The next morning, Sophia awoke to find a handmade poster taped to her door. It read, in crooked letters cut from construction paper, You're not the nanny. You're our always. She sat down on the hallway floor, one hand pressed to her heart, and cried, for everything lost, everything found, and everything still to come. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.